And want to, of course, thank for our host committee. We would have been delighted to have you here at the University of Florida. We've made many plans to bring you here, wine and dine you, have a nice dinner at a museum, and have all the amenities for you. But unfortunately, none of that came to pass. So we decided to move ahead with this virtual conference, but there was still work that our host committee did in preparation for an in-person conference that didn't take place. Also want to thank our program committee who reviewed the proposals and came up with, I think, which is an excellent program. All of the proposals were high quality. So we only had to not present just a couple of proposals just because they didn't fit very well into a panel that we had. So that was unfortunate. I think if we had done this in person, we had plans to have a poster session, and we would have made sure that every proposal to the ESRA conference had been accepted, at the very least as poster for the poster presentations. Also want to thank our staff. Sarah Loving and Alexandra Quintana helped quite a bit at the early stages when we thought that we were still doing this in person. They helped me with hotel reservations and space reservations and menus. And again, we had all this planned out. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. And then Peter's been helping on later with the virtual side of things, managing many of the email contacts that we've had with folks and making sure that this presentation, for example, could be available. So Peter has really been more part of the virtual side of this conference. And Peter's on the market next year, graduate student. So hopefully you'll take a look at him if you're thinking about hiring one of our excellent graduates from the University of Florida. Want to thank our sponsors, and I put sponsors in quotations. Of course, the Department of Political Sciences provided support with Peter Licari as a research assistant. And I say this tongue-in-cheek that the Virginia Department of Elections is sponsoring this as well. I say that because what we've done here is we've set up a quasi-corporate account that allows me to do projects for outside organizations. We did one for the Virginia Department of Elections. We're currently doing some work for the Washington Post, and that's a revenue stream. I'm taking my salary and setting it aside. I'm not actually taking it as salary, and that's what's actually funding the webinar portion of this and funded Sarah's and Alexandra's salaries in support of the conference. So we found this to be a useful way for us to be able to do projects that don't necessarily require a grant from an organization, but are more of a way to invoice. And it's providing us a revenue stream to do activities like this at the University of Florida, which is to host the ESRA conference. So anyways, thank you very much for attending. And look, this is a webinar, and it's the first time that we've tried this Zoom webinar. So undoubtedly there are going to be hiccups. We just experienced one, but we managed to overcome it. So hopefully things will go smooth. For you in the audience, as I was mentioning before I launched into this introduction, there is a Q&A button available to you that you can pose questions to the presenters as they're making the presentations. At the end of the presentations and the discussant comments and a chance for the presenters to respond to those comments, I will step in as moderator and look through those Q&A questions. I'll also monitor the chat in case there's questions that are posed in the chat, and I will act as a voice for you to pose your questions to the presenters. Again, I encourage you to go to the conference program website, and the papers are downloadable there. You can read those. There's a a tool called Hypothesis that you can use to annotate those papers and provide comments to the paper authors directly through that tool. So I encourage you to use that if you, as another opportunity for you to provide feedback and questions to the presenters. So with that, we're going to start the panel, and we'll do this in typically as what we do in the with a conference in the order in which the presenters are listed. So we're going to start with Kevin Morris, and he has a paper on purged voters in North Carolina.
Okay, can folks hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Before we dig in, I want to just thank the folks at University of Florida. Like Michael was just saying, a lot of work has been done to make this good, and I'm excited for it, excited to be leading us off. I'm grateful to everyone watching because you gave me an excuse to have my first at-home coronavirus haircut yesterday. So that's great. So we're going to dive in, talk about voter cancellations, voter list maintenance in North Carolina, and the effects that inaccurate list maintenance might be having on representation of the electorate. Let's see if I can, there we go. Okay. Before we get into the meat of it, we're going to talk a little bit about background on removal rules, NVRA. I know a lot of people on this call are very familiar with it, but we'll touch on it briefly. Going to give a brief overview of literature on voter list data, how it sometimes is not as good as we would want it to be, what that means for who stays on the rolls, who gets removed, and implications of that on the electorate. I'm going to start the analysis section of this by looking at all folks who have their registrations canceled over a 6-year period in North Carolina. Just a general look at what registrations are canceled. After looking at all registrations that are canceled, going to identify the folks that were removed and then tried to cast a provisional ballot after being removed while attesting that they had not moved since they'd been purged. And then finally, we'll look and ask whether or not the provisional ballot process protected the voters from being inappropriately removed from the rolls. Okay, so as I said, brief background on the removal practices. Generally, states, of course, and jurisdictions have different practices. We'll be hearing more papers about this in a little bit, about geographic variation. In North Carolina, a voter can be removed if a county election administrator receives direct information from the voter. They can either write to the county and say, hey, I have moved, I am no longer eligible, I no longer want to be registered here. In North Carolina, voters can also be removed immediately upon the election administrators learning that that voter has died. In most states around the country, you lose the right to vote for at least some period after being convicted of a felony offense. In North Carolina, the process works such that every month, the Department of Corrections sends the list of all folks convicted of felony offenses to the election administrators. They send their name and their county of residence, and only if available, they'll send over the residential address. So there's some room there for some false positives. If the residential address isn't provided by the Department of Corrections, anyone with that name in that county is at risk of being removed. So a mailer is sent, and then the voter has 30 days to respond. Of course, even if the county does have the residential address, if there's a junior or a senior living at the same address, there's the possibility that the wrong voter is identified as having been convicted of a felony. Then the notice and waiting period under the NVRA, and then of course the use it or lose it provisions. If a county has reason to suspect that a voter has moved, whether that's from the National Change of Address database or other information, Eric, they can send a postcard to a voter, and if the voter neither returns that postcard nor votes in the 2 subsequent federal elections, they can then be removed. Lots of talk these days about the use it or lose it provisions, and of course after the 2018 decision from the Supreme Court, upholding Ohio's supplemental process. North Carolina is sometimes considered a use it or lose it state, sometimes not. Failure to vote is not the explicit trigger for the notice and waiting period in North Carolina. If you go 2 years without confirming your address to the county election administrator, you can get started on that process. In practice, there's not a whole heck of a lot of daylight between voting and confirming your address. That's the way that most people do confirm their addresses is by voting. So throughout this, I will refer to North Carolina as a use it or lose it state while recognizing that is the explicit trigger. There's a bunch of literature that's come out over the past decade or so showing that there's a lot of variation in voter list maintenance in the quality of the data that election administrators have on hand. 2010 paper from Monsalva and Aiton Hirsch showed that around the country, often registrations are missing information that is necessary to even determine whether or not an individual is eligible to vote. Leah has a paper out from just this year looking at data in Mississippi, showing that, that administrators sometimes don't correctly mark whether or not a voter has participated in an election. And of course, when we think about the notice and waiting period, if someone is on that notice and waiting period and they do vote but are inaccurately marked as not having voted, they might find their registration canceled after that. And then I think this is the very next paper on this panel, talking about geographic variation within a given state, even within Florida. Different counties conduct list maintenance in different ways. They remove Deadwood in different ways. They confirm registrations in different ways. So even within a given state, lots of variation in how voters are kept on or not kept on the rolls. Charles Stewart, of course, and Steve Pettigrew also have some work out there on similar type stuff. Some questions about the representational implications of inaccurate list maintenance. Not as much research on this, and this is where I'm hoping that this project can move us forward one baby step forward. There's a paper from 1975, obviously long before the NVRA, showing that in areas with more aggressive list maintenance, turnout is lower. Guy Stewart in 2004 showed that DOC data in Florida used to remove folks that were disenfranchised because of a felony conviction was inaccurate, and that there were folks that shouldn't have been removed from the rolls. And then at the Brennan Center, we've done a number of studies over the past few years showing that in parts of the country that were previously covered under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, they saw their removal rates increase after the Shelby County decision nullified the pre-clearance condition. We use EAVS data there, which, there's caveats on the EAVS data, of course, but more importantly, using county level data makes it tough to tell if within counties there are any racial disparities in who is being removed, those Shelby County. In the popular press, there are lots of stories about voter purges and their racially disparate impact. Here in Brooklyn, I'm in Brooklyn, our local NPR affiliate in 2016 reported that a big purge disproportionately hit Latinos in the borough. Lots of folks on the call, I'm sure, will remember last year in Texas when the Secretary of State said that he had identified tens of thousands of non-citizens on the rolls. And it turned out that most of them, or a lot of them at least, had become naturalized citizens in the period since they had submitted data in their driver's license application saying they weren't citizens. And in Arkansas in 2016, just to pick another example, the DOC sent over information about folks that had been convicted of felonies but were no longer disenfranchised because of that. And it also included people that had never been convicted of felonies. So we have a lot of information, both from the data quality side, that our data might not be awesome. There's a little bit of research out there indicating that there might be some racial disparities there, and then popular press reporting as well that there might be something going on here, but it's tough to kind of wrap our heads around or get at this question of who is wrongfully purged. I'm going to define in this project a wrongful purge is the cancellation of the registration of a voter whose legal eligibility to vote had not changed. I want to be clear that I'm distinguishing that from an illegal purge. both in the Ohio setup and in other circumstances, voters can legally be purged even when the state has no affirmative information that voter's eligibility to vote had not changed. So even though a removal might be legal, I'm going to argue that it is wrongful if it removed someone who was still every bit as eligible to vote the day before and the day after they were removed. To identify the wrongful purges, we need to leverage some kind of a post-removal interaction with the state. We can take, and this is what I do, we can take 2 snapshots of the registered voter file, and we can identify the folks that fall off in a given period of time. But we can't identify the people that were removed because they had died or because they had moved or been convicted of a felony from the folks that the state thought had died or thought had moved. To do that, we need to leverage some kind of interaction with the state database after that removal, in which the voter affirms, says, no, hang on, I still live there. I sure as heck haven't died. I'm still eligible to vote. But this is necessarily going to leave a lot of people out. I'll get into this a little bit more when I talk about the actual setup here. But we can imagine, especially for voters on the fringe who are maybe more at risk of being removed because of inactivity, if they get removed and then they don't re-register or they don't try and cast a provisional ballot, we're not going to be able to pick them up. We're not going to be able to identify them. So the idea that we'll ever get the full set of incorrectly purged or wrongfully purged voters is probably, well, we'll say for now it remains a pipe dream. So for this project, what I'm doing is I'm taking 2 snapshots of the registered voter file in North Carolina. I'm taking one from the general election in 2010 and another from 2016. Just merging those together. Voters have unique IDs that travel with them across time and when they move within the state. So we can actually get a pretty good sense of who is removed, what registrations are canceled in that 6-year period. And then for my post-removal interaction with the state, I'm going to leverage the individual level provisional ballot data from the 2016 general election. North Carolina makes really good provisional ballot data available in which voters list their name and the address at which they live. Of course, not every voter who was removed over that 6-year period and cast a provisional ballot in 2016 was wrongfully purged. Some of them, no doubt, moved within the state and didn't know that they needed to re-register or thought that that the registration would come with them. So we impose a tighter restriction on it. A wrongful purge is someone who was removed over that 6-year period and in their 2016 provisional ballot listed the address at which they were registered in 2010. So these folks obviously hadn't died and they were swearing on their absentee ballot, their provisional ballot. We've all been talking so much about absentee ballots these days. On their provisional ballot in 2016, that they lived where they were previously registered. The only other reason for which someone might have been quote unquote correctly purged is if they were convicted of a felony offense. I talk about that a little bit in the paper, not going to get into that too much in the body of this because it is complicated using the state's data, but a robustness check in the paper shows that it probably doesn't impact our results at all. So I'm going to begin with a brief overview of who got removed, what registrations were canceled over the 6-year period. Apologies to Dan and to anyone who read the paper. The paper uses a logit model. I'm presenting OLS output here. It's exactly the same or virtually identical. I just figured it was easier for a presentation to show these outputs. Not a lot going on when it comes to race, ethnicity. Black voters may be a little less likely to see their registrations canceled. Latinos a little bit more likely, but all within about a 5 percentage point range. Again, there's some stuff going on here. Democrats a little more likely to be removed than Republicans or Libertarians. Unaffiliated voters a little more likely. And then men also similarly a little more likely to be removed. This plot doesn't show it well at all, and I apologize for that, but young voters and old voters are more likely to be removed than middle-aged voters. Not particularly surprising, because we know that young voters are more likely to move and older registered voters are more likely to pass away over a 6-year period. What I don't include on this plot, because the estimates are so far off to the right, that they make everything else tough to read are the share of a neighborhood that had moved in the past 12 months and the share of a neighborhood that were non-citizens using census data, using the registration geocoded to census tracts. Neighborhoods with lots of movers and lots of non-citizens have substantially higher removal rates. The neighborhood mover piece, not particularly surprising. We would expect where more people are moving, more Deadwood to be culled, but the neighborhood percent non-citizen is a little bit surprising. Okay, so after identifying our whole pool of who was removed, and I should have mentioned this, about 20% of voters registered in 2010 were no longer registered as of 2016. So over this 6-year period, there's about a 20% removal rate. Then I take these folks and I look to see who cast that provisional ballot in 2016 at the same address at which they were registered. And there are really big racial disparities. About 1 in 1,000 voters that was removed cast a provisional ballot in 2016 where they were previously registered. But that number goes up to about 14.6, almost 15 voters who show up after being purged at the same address among Black purged voters, but that drops to 8.5 for white voters. The other racial ethnic groups, really big standard errors. Unsurprisingly, this is getting cut off. It should say 95% confidence bar at the bottom, but that's neither here nor there. But those other groups are not as widely represented in North Carolina. Most voters are white and Black. The other groups are there, of course, but harder to get much purchase on statistical significance. These effects remain even after controlling for the other demographics that we have available. Again, the other races and ethnicities, not much going on there, but Black voters do remain substantially more likely to show up and vote after being purged than white voters. Not a whole lot going on with the partisan stuff here. Men, a little bit more likely again to show up after being removed. Young voters, quite a bit more likely to show up and vote after being removed. And voters in lower income neighborhoods are also more likely to show up and vote after being removed to cast that provisional ballot. So while we don't see much evidence of much racial disparity stuff going on with overall removals, it does seem that there's perhaps, that Black voters are perhaps more likely to be removed despite not having their eligibility to vote. And then finally, I'm going to ask whose provisional ballots are rejected. Dan and Leah have a paper out using the same data from North Carolina, and this is largely built on them. But again, so I take that pool of folks who cast a provisional ballot at the address at which they were registered in 2016 to look to see who's count, and we see once again really big racial disparities. Of those wrongfully purged folks, 70.3% of Black voters had their provisional ballot completely rejected, while the same was true of just 39% of white voters. So it seems that Black voters are both more likely to cast a provisional ballot, to be wrongfully purged, and are less protected from that wrongful purge by the provisional ballot process. Once again, so some of that discrepancy can be explained by other individual and geographic level characteristics, not a whole lot of it. The other covariates from the previous models I've dropped off because they're almost all completely non-significant. Race is the big one here. And then voters who were removed after missing 2 federal elections, who were part of the quote unquote use it or lose it purge, they were a lot more likely to have their provisional ballots counted. I think that might have something to do with the fact that the state never had affirmative evidence that they had that their eligibility had changed, so maybe they were more likely to accept that voter's provisional ballot because they weren't looking at other data indicating otherwise. But it's unclear from the data why they were more likely to have their provisional ballots counted. So in conclusion, voters of color were not more likely to see their registrations canceled than white voters overall, but they are maybe more likely to be wrongfully removed. They were more likely to show up in 2016 and say that their information, their eligibility to vote hadn't changed since 2010. And troublingly, it seems unclear why Black voters who were wrongfully purged were so much more likely to have their ballots rejected. But it seems like there might be some discrepancy in how election administrators deal with unregistered voters casting a provisional ballot. Again, none of these folks were registered in 2016, so they all should have been treated relatively equally by the law. Certainly, they should not have been treated differently under the law based on their race, of course. So I think that for future work, trying to get provisional ballot data from other states, trying to replicate this other places, I've sent out public records requests to a number of states, and no one else is, of the states I've sent it to, I haven't gotten good data back where we could replicate this. And then I think another way of kind of cracking this nut might be looking to see what voters are removed and then re-register at the address at which they were previously removed. Most of the voters that I identify here as being wrongfully purged were re-registered at their 2010 address by the 2018 election. So trying to get some purchase on question using re-registration as that post-removal interaction with the state might give us a little bit more insight into what's going on here. So that's my presentation. Thank you for listening, and it's hot here. It might be hot where you are, so thanks for suffering with me. And I'm interested to hear y'all's questions, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin. So next up we have Silvia Kim, and who is at the California Institute of Technology, just graduated and now has a job at American University. So congratulations to Silvia. And Jian Chow, I hope I'm getting your name right, and Michael Alvarez, who are still at the California Institute of Technology. And their papers on list maintenance in Florida.
Thank you, Mike. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Hi, how are you? Thank you for the University of Florida faculty for arranging this. And if I'd known that this was going on YouTube, I probably should have had a haircut. But anyway, this is a joint paper, like Mike just said, with Jian Chow and our Mike Alvarez. And I will co-present this with Jian today. So our question in this paper is the following: how do we ensure the accuracy and integrity of a statewide voter registration database, which often depends on aggregating decentralized sub-state data sets with different list maintenance practices? And I'm happy that Kevin has actually cited this paper in the previous presentation. Thank you very much. And let me get to what the background and how we got into this research. So this paper was motivated by the fact that the Mueller report specifically said that several jurisdictions' data has been breached by the Russian government hackers. And in particular, lawmakers found out that 2 Florida counties have had their databases broken into. And after an FBI briefing, Florida Governor DeSantis said that Russian hackers had gained access to voter databases, and he wasn't supposed to disclose which of them were, but eventually people found out that one of them was Washington County. We still don't know which other county it was, to my knowledge. And then while there was much chaos, obviously, and then we asked the following question: suppose that malicious entities did gain access to particular jurisdiction databases, and then unlike what really happened, managed to successfully manipulate the records. Or let's imagine a scenario in which there are no malicious external entities, but a particular county makes a mistake in its list maintenance, and then makes changes to their data, which should not happen. For example, they accidentally turned all partisans into non-partisans ahead of a primary, and then some of them might not be able to vote in the voters to vote in the primaries. And then we asked, would we be able to tell these instances from looking at the data? If we had reasonable suspicions about some unwanted local variations in the data, how will we tell? And then the thing is, the Help American Vote Act of 2002, it requires a centralized statewide voter registration list to be maintained. But like we just showed, there are some concerns about the accuracy and integrity of these legacy databases. And this stems really from the fact, a large portion of it is because the election administration in the US is so highly decentralized. The states are required to keep tab and maintain a statewide voter file, but it really is an aggregation from smaller sub-state data sets. Some of it is county, in some states it's municipal levels. And we have to expect, due to this decentralization, that there should be a lot of local variations. And if there is a local data mishap, can we detect it using from a state level data set? What we use in this data is to use a statistical model to see if what we can detect any particular instance that's really off the normal level of variations that we would expect. We use a Bayesian multivariate multi-level model. We are trying to account for common patterns in the local data and detect anomalies. The data that we use is 2016 monthly voter file snapshots from Florida from June to December. We use the probabilistic record linkage on voter file snapshots, as in Kim, Schneider, and Alvarez 2019. Whereas that paper was a single county analysis, our focus is on statewide because we really want to be able to compare and contrast what's happening in the counties. And more importantly, we're trying to model multiple response variables. So this really means that we know that there are changes to the voter file are multifaceted. For example, we could have voters who are added to the file, voters who are removed from the file, voters who have their address changed, and so on and so forth. And we jointly model these different aspects of the changes so that they have a correlated structure. Now, this I didn't want to make it too complicated, but it's a mouthful, what I just said. But essentially what I'm saying here in this paper is that we want to really see what is similar and try to detect what is different if a single county's data is differently configured compared to the rest of them. And now I'll hand it over to Jian to explain the details of the model and then to present the results of our analysis.
Okay, thank you, Silvia. Hello, everyone. My name is Jian Cao. I'm a postdoc scholar at the Division of Humanities and Social Science at Caltech. Thanks for having us. I'm going to talk about the model and the result sections, and then I'll give it back to Silvia. In this study, we use a multivariate model to account for the common patterns in changes while detecting anomalies. The model can be written as follows. Okay. In this model, we can see the Y is the list of dependent variables. It includes the following changes in the voter files. Voter added, voter deleted, or we can see voter removed, as well as the records changed in last name, address, birth date, voter status, and party. We use change rates instead of changes as dependent variables in our model to capture the differences in voter population across counties. The change rates are modeled jointly as we see these response variables are correlated. That was the columns of the matrix of the dependent variables. Now we talk about the rows. Each row of the dependent variable matrix is an observation of the changes for county at a time. Sorry, at a time. So we have 67 counties in Florida state. And for each county, we match the snapshots 6 times. So, so there are 402 observations. Let's go back to this model. In the dependent variable matrix, ynp, n is the number of observations, which is 402. P is the number of jointly modeled dependent variables, which is 7. This is the multivariate part of this model. The next part is function h. We assume that the change rates follow zero inflated beta distributions. The zero inflated beta distribution is used here to utilize the beta distribution to model the change rates and also account for the fact that the change rates can contain many zeros. And the X is the list of explanatory variables. It contains the county and time indicators to capture the group level effects so that the patterns across counties and over time are explained by the model, and the variance that cannot be explained will stand out. Here, the R is the number of group level effects, which is 2. Beta is the coefficient matrix, and the epsilon is the error term. With this model, we use 2 methods to detect the anomalies. One of them is the simple box whiskers comparison, and the other is a Bayesian study. In the Bayesian study, we use STAN to implement Hamiltonian Markov-Chain Monte Carlo to estimate the multivariate model. And after the Hamiltonian MCMC process is converged, we use the posterior distributions to make 24,000 predictions for each change rates, and then detect the data points that are significantly different from model predictions. Next, let's see what we have found. We first show the box whiskers comparisons of the change rates. The added, dropped, and change rates are grouped by time. So each box is for a time period. Only outliers that are outside 3 times the interquartile range will be labeled. So we can see the proportion of records added that increases in the pre-election period and falls sharply after the election. The only outlier in the added rate plot is Baker County. And in the dropped rate plot, it is generally flat over time. From November to December 2016, 7 counties had very high record dropping rates. They are Citrus, Duval, Leon, Hormuz, Taylor, Sumter, and Wharton. And they are even beyond the 5 times interquartile range. Oh, excuse me. So moving on to the change rates of last name, address, and other fields. The proportion of records changed in the 5 fields are generally similar between June to September, sharply climbing in September to October, and then dropping in October to November. we found 69 outliers outside the 3 times interquartile range from these box plots, including the added and dropped streets. However, these are not necessarily evidence of internal or external data manipulations in these counties, since the voter files we have are extracted on the first day of the month. The outliers are likely maintenance activities after the election date. Beyond the simple box whiskers plots, next we show the results of the Bayesian analysis. Let's see if it has the similar results. In the Bayesian analysis, we used the Hamiltonian Markov chain Monte Carlo to estimate the multivariate model and assume that the common patterns in change rates are captured by the model. We then used the converged posterior distribution to predict the change rates and find the data points that are statistically different from model predictions. In these figures, we show the t-scores for the change rates in the Florida voter file. Any t-scores that are larger than 1.96 are considered statistical significance at 5% confidence level. We then reject the null and conclude that the data points are significantly different from the model predictions. So in the dropped rates plot, we can see Citrus, Duval, Leon, Holmes, Taylor, Sumter, and Walton counties are significantly different from model prediction, which is consistent with the box plots. For the changes in the 5 fields, the Bayesian method also reveals many significant deviations. For instance, from July to August, 5 counties that are Homers, Calhoun, Nassau, DeSoto, and Gulf had significant high party change rates. While we are pointing out the deviations individually, we notice that some counties' names appear frequently in these figures. So we count the occurrence of each county and plot the following figure. This map shows out of 42 events, which is 7 response variables times 6 time periods. So we want to show how many times did each county deviate from the model prediction. So there are 42 counties that had at least 1 deviation and 22 counties that had at least 2 deviations. Collier, Franklin, Lee, and Liberty County had 3 deviations. Holmes, Lafayette, and Union County had 4. And Baker County, which was the one with the most deviations, had its change rate significantly different from model prediction in 5 events. It would be interesting to know how list maintenance practices of Baker, Homers, Lafayette, and Union counties differ from the rest of the states. But by now, we don't have a deductive theory that might help us explain it. Okay, so I'll give it back to Silvia. Thanks.
Oops. Sorry about that. Okay, so we just saw that as a proof of concept that if we wanted to investigate the integrity of a statewide voter file, considering that there can be a lot of local variations, but we still want to see if any particular county really stands out, this is how we would do it. Again, we're not finger pointing at any of these particular counties that we've mentioned. They might just have different practices in how they maintain their lists, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing something wrong or or that they're making unwanted changes. And we see that we show that there are very different patterns in the additions, deletions, changes of voter records, depending on which county we're talking about. There's this clear heterogeneity. And again, there's very little deductive theory about why these differences may occur. What is one county doing compared to the other county is not well modeled, nor is that particular data tracked very well. But I believe that this shows that from a state's point of view, it will yield some utility to keep watch on these countywide changes to see if any particular jurisdiction, it really sticks out compared to the rest of the trends in its sub-state jurisdictions. That's it for our presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was excellent. All righty. So next, we'll move on to Carl Klarner and Leah Miravaki, who are, again, everyone's working on list maintenance. This is very much tied into this outlier detection in a different way, which is trying to forecast monthly county voter registration changes.
Excellent. Can everybody hear me? Everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, as you can see, Leah Miravaki is on the paper too. She didn't want to be on the program. She said she was on there too many times. Maybe she was waiting to see what the paper would be like, whether she'd be embarrassed to have her name associated with it or whatever. But I'm hoping that the paper has met her standards. So anyway, she's been a great collaborator and has contributed a lot to this. Slight title change now is forecasting monthly county voter registration totals. I'm trying to get my, yeah, okay, overview of where we're going. I'm gonna tell you about the new data collection that I've engaged in. It's the beginning of this large scale project. We'll talk about the model of monthly county level voter registrants by party, and then I'll show you some time series of voter registration data over in counties, so you can see examples of concentrated drops in voter registration. Okay, so the project goals. So build a forecasting model that can help administrators prepare for increases in applications, for example. So we're trying to forecast the number of registrants over time and the changes in those registrants. Also try and estimate Deadwood registrants. If we can do this, then we can adjust the data and maybe make the data more useful. Also adjusting the Deadwood, the process of adjusting the Deadwood out will also give us more insight into the administration of voter registration records. Okay, so we use a forecasting model to do this. It'll have election predictors, things about elections like competitiveness of elections, also demographic variables. Demographics aren't in this. I'm gonna wait until the decennial is done to start dealing with all that and focus more on collecting the voter registration data. Secondly, use sudden and large drops in voter registration totals to help estimate Deadwood. It depends on the county and the biennium, but sometimes these drops are very concentrated. So we want to use, to make good forecasts, you have to have long time series and as small of a unit of analysis as possible. And so voter file data is great, but it just doesn't go back in time enough to really capture a lot of contextual changes that might affect forecasts. So you want a robust time series that will insulate you from these shocks to the system like COVID-19 or whatever. Okay, so what kind of things can we use voter registration totals for to forecast? Post-census population estimates. The census is understandably, you know, there's some major error in the estimates that they make. The average county is 3% off between decennials as far as their post-census estimates. targeting areas for mobilization efforts, forecasting turnout, and then election forecasting. You can use voter registration data for all these things, but maybe we can adjust it and make those forecasts even more accurate. Okay, so far I've collected 6 states worth of data, and here's an overview. So Alabama, Florida, Iowa, Maryland, Oregon, Wyoming, generally back to about 2,000 depending on the state. These are monthly data. The data can be quite rich. In the case of Maryland, for example, there was almost 1 million data points, all kinds of breakdowns. The information on the right, the right side of the slide shows you some of the breakdowns that are available. So all but Alabama have party breakdowns. Alabama has race and then active versus inactive status. Florida has drops, ads, confirmation letters, responses to those confirmation letters, mode of application. I can't see the right part of my screen, but oh, I shouldn't have done that. All right, sorry. Okay, so now I can see it. So yeah, there's a lot of breakdowns, a lot of detail in these data.
You stopped your screen share.
Oh,
Carl.
sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we're back onto screen share.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. All right, here's an example of one of the reports. So you can see that they have specific information about new valid people, deleted people. They've got the number of confirmation notices sent out, responses. So this is for Florida. Unfortunately, the more I delved into this, the more ambiguities there are in the data that have to be resolved. This is Maryland, definitely the most detailed state. So you've got new registrants by party, removals by party, and then you've got all these different reasons for removal or the mode that they use to register. Unfortunately, this stops at the end of 2010, but that's also kind of nice because since we have the earlier data, it can be married to voter file data. But anyway, there's a lot of detail in the data that's been collected. Okay, here's an example of monthly voter registration data aggregated to the state level, just so you can see the general. Wyoming is a state that the counties are more, they move together more with what's going on at the state level. So you see these giant downturns. So obviously Wyoming has EDR, so they're not covered by the 90-day prohibition on removing people because they didn't vote and didn't, respond to a confirmation letter, et cetera. So Wyoming apparently really goes to town after midterm elections. People haven't voted in 2 federal elections in a row, and then they cut people left and right. But it's also very important to look at this because if you're just looking at biennial data, you won't see these giant drops in registrants right after midterm elections. So again, people register for the presidential, then they don't register. I don't know. Yeah, I guess that doesn't make sense. But there's these huge drop-offs after the midterm elections there, and it's consistent across all the counties. Now, another thing is I'm going to show you data from the EAVS Election Administration and Voting Survey. I don't mean to criticize that survey, and I didn't dig at all to find this these errors in that survey. I just, right before this presentation, I just decided to grab, what does EAVS say about this? So I'm not doing this to take down EAVS or whatever. And again, I can't emphasize enough, this is just one example. I wasn't digging for anything. So according to the state data is on the top, and the November 2nd report said there are 270,000 registrants. The December 1st report said there were 277. Okay, so I don't have to read every number. March, so the key is that March is when the giant downturn occurred. So they got rid of 60,000 people from the rolls there statewide. Then it builds up again with the next election. So the EAVS has the numbers from the months, the reports that I put the stars next to. So they do capture some downturn here because, and the other thing about this is there's a lot of uncertainty in these reports about which is the last one that includes the closing date of the election. In this case, since it's EDR, election day. So apparently for the model you're about to see, and the way I did that, I just assumed that November 2nd would be the one that included election day, and that it would include the election day registrants, but apparently doesn't. You have to wait until December. So the EAVS actually reported that turnout was higher than registrants in 2012 because they have the report that's adding the same day registrants. So that's kind of one illustration of why these monthly data are important to look at. There's a lot of, you can just think about the psychology of how people are filling out the EAVS survey or how they're doing these reports. And you can easily imagine that people are going to get confused and not consistently talk about what, this vagary about which report is going to include the general election. So many of these states don't have dates on the reports. I'm still trying to figure out, which date does this actually apply to. Anyway, so a few points from this. One, looking at these monthly data are very important because you see the downturn. You wouldn't see the downturn if you're just looking at the snapshot that's at the end of a biennium, which is how the EAVS is structured, like the question wording is oriented. And then secondly, you can see that there are mistakes that are made that you can kind of try and figure out how to deal with if you have the monthly data. Okay, so let's talk about the model predicting change in monthly voter registration totals. One principle of forecasting is bottom-up versus top-down forecasting. So for example, I could try and forecast total registrants and make that the dependent variable, total number of registrants in a county in a report, aka month. But it's better to forecast something smaller and then aggregate up from that. So as a result, I'm going to forecast Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliated or whatever other instead of just total registrants. So yeah, there's a huge literature outside of political science on forecasting and what general types of things work to forecast things. Use hierarchical linear modeling. Would make sense that upticks in registration would be correlated for Dems, Republicans, and independents. On the other hand, there might be lots of differences in what drives these upticks. Merely for this preliminary look with these just 5 states, I'm looking at in-sample model merely. So I'm not doing like trying to simulate out-of-sample forecasts or cutting off part of the data set and using the other data set for training purposes or whatever. So it's just basic social science at this point. Merely predicting 1 month out, it might make sense in some context to want to predict not just 1 month out, but 2 and 3 and 4 months out to help people plan, maybe even 2 years out. And for the model here, I'm only using the 5 states that have party registration of the 6 that I've collected. 139,000 cases. All right, so the predictor variables, kind of mechanical ones like business days in report, days in report. Even though it's not a business day, maybe having more days allows people more time to register to vote, fill out forms, whatever. Business days with a ban on purging, in other words, a 90-day prohibition on, I just call it purging for convenience. Business days, voter registration is closed. There's actually some non-trivial variation from state to state in how many business days there are, especially because these reports sometimes come out on different days of the month. Then I've got an EDR dummy, and then that's interacted with general election. You know, report is in the, report contains the general election or has the month that the general election is in. EDR primary interaction. I'll just say right now, those are statistically significant and positive. So when there's a general election and there's EDR, more people register, even though I apparently messed it up for Wyoming. So all the election dummies I'm going to tell you about are led between 0 and 6 months. So what that means is, if it's led 6 months, that means that people are thinking, oh, I got to register to vote. The election's in 6 months, or oh, I got to register to vote. It's in 5 months. So it's about how people are anticipating the fact that they have to register. So I've got basic election dummies. Does a report contain the general election, a presidential general election, primary election, or runoff primaries, or a special election, the latter being county specific. Then I got a whole host of competitive election variables. Is the presidential election a pivotal state? I'm only looking at 5 states, so there's not very much variation. I mean, there's a perfect correlation between, you know, stateness, Florida-ness, and being a pivotal state. Almost about half the years in Iowa are coded as being pivotal, but the other 3 states are never pivotal. Competitive gubernatorial election, competitive US Senate election. Again, there's problems with this because in the general election, oh, it should say competitive US Senate general election. You know, Wyoming is never going to be competitive. So again, there's some problems there, which will be solved once more states are added. Then I've got, you know, similar variables for US House, county specific, since it's not statewide. Then I've got primary variables measuring the competitiveness of primaries. So for example, is the presidential primary, is the nomination contest unsettled by the time it comes to a state? And then for the Dems and Republicans separately, is it a competitive gubernatorial primary or competitive US Senate primary? All right, so these are some results. Midterm elections, you do see more people registering before general elections, even in midterms. So it goes up by about 8 per 100,000 VEP. You got to multiply all these numbers by 3 because there's 3 party categories if you're thinking about the impact on the total. Presidential elections, the boost is larger. It's about 2% of VEP. So this is the total effect. You can see it ramping up by state. It goes up, and these are all statistically significant for many of the lead variables. This is impact of a state primary. So registration goes up even before primaries, but not that much. But then, the presidential primaries didn't work out at all, whether it's unsettled. So that's not a big impact. Competitive gubernatorial primaries, so there's substantial increases in registration the month before that, and even the month of. And then US Senate primary competitive is especially, especially boost registration before the primary for the party with that competitive primary. One, it brings to mind Wyoming, right? So like everybody knows who's going to win the general election when it comes to the U.S. Senate election. So maybe lots of people get mobilized into the competitive primaries there when they have them for U.S. Senate, especially because it's such a small state, such an advantageous translation of campaign spending into mobilizing people. And then the special elections and runoff elections didn't really pan out, but there's some impact there. Okay, future additions to the model, obviously more states, obvious interactions. I should have thrown in a interaction between EDR and party. It would make sense that it would mobilize Democrats more than Republicans. And then you can just start interacting every possible dummy variable you can think of all the ones that we just saw. It's easy to spin rationales for those. Demographic variables have to be added, and then make this into an error correction model. Okay, so I'm going to show you some examples of sudden and large drops in registrants, so you can see where I'm coming from about using that. Now, obviously, when you're looking at total registrants, if you don't have separate breakdowns and totals of drops and adds, you're dealing with the fact that you only know the net. And so if there aren't large downturns, and we still don't know how many people were dropped when there is a large downturn, we're just given more information about it. So I'm not in any way saying that I'm going to infer how many people were dropped just from net change, but it is extremely useful in conjunction with other pieces of information to help with estimates of how many people have been dropped. So you're going to use the forecasting model to help estimate that, and you're going to use large drops. You're going to use, demographic change. So this is an example of large drops. I don't know what that is. Like, not 100,000 people, but it's like they dropped a bunch of people in 1 month. And Florida, the counties do not drop people at the same time either, which pertains to the other paper on this panel that is just looking at 5 months. Like a lot of these counties, I was looking at 2016 because of that paper, and a lot of counties drop people early in the biennium, some people after that point. Anyway, you can see that you can infer that a bunch of people were dropped for sure in whatever that is, 2008. Sarasota, another example. I'm only using the big counties. If I showed you small counties, it would look way more extreme because they're going after people in specific states, specific months. So here's Sarasota. You can see that maybe 10,000 people or so were dropped here. More than that, I guess. Almost 20,000 people were dropped. Other examples, Okalasa. So again, you can see these, and you can't see this with biennial data. It's more clear when there's monthly data. Pinellas, again, lots of drops, lots of concentration in drops. And then it doesn't just happen in Florida, it happens in Iowa too. Okay, so I've given you an overview of where this project is going and the data that I've been collecting. So I'll turn it over to Mike.
Wonderful. So now we have discussant comments from Dan Smith. And by that, after that, we will allow the presenters to respond if they wish to, and then go to audience questions. Just a reminder, if you have questions, please put those questions into that question and answer dialog box. And Carl, if you would stop your screen share, that would be awesome. We can stop it for you.
I'm trying, man. Oh yeah, right.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Thank you to Mike McDonald and the team here at UF for putting on this virtual conference. We did have a lot of fun things for you lined up here, but we'll do it again some other time. It is a little warm. We do have this little virus going around, but other than that, things are just cheery. So I also wanted to just give a shout out to a lot of folks who are on the line for dialing in. We have a mix of academics and practitioners. I also just wanted to give a shout out to Mike McDonald, who was recently promoted to full professor. So give Mike a big clap of hands next time he's on. All right, I'm gonna go through these, I think fairly rapidly in the order that they were presented. Really nice coherence on a theme of voter list maintenance and really anomaly detection. A lot of different ways with some added on little instruments to tease and excite those who are actually interested in, especially Florida, North Carolina. All right, so Kevin's paper, I think you've got a lot of interesting things going on here. The idea of matching up these two different snapshots of the North Carolina voter file makes a lot of sense. I am wondering whether or not you have thought about actually looking at the North Carolina voter file and the field of that they have in there of whether you're active or inactive. I'm just sharing my screen. This is, I think, a 2017 voter file. They do include whether or not a voter registration was denied, as well as the inactive, but also removed and the reason for removal. And so the first thing is I'm curious as to whether or not those actually match up to the snapshots that you have, that you've paired to identify the people have been removed. So that's something to think about. Maybe you already have. The other thing is North Carolina provides, as we all know, a wealth of data. And for instance, I can't remember where I got this, but I don't think it was litigation. But here's a whole list of people who were removed and their registrations canceled and the reason. And it's like 80,000 long, if I recall. Anyway, another thing that you could kind of use and look to see whether or not these two snapshots are actually matching up with the other data and kind of triangulate things. So I think that's all good. I'm glad you clarified your interpretation of the logit models. I was going to chide you on that and not transforming them into log odds. Translating these log odds into transforming them. But since Paul Gronke doesn't look like he's on the list, I'm going to chide you for your use of wrongfully purged. I know you work at the Brennan Center, so you can get away with that. And I joke because Michael Herron and I got chided for using a similar, well, actually not even that toxic, just purged at ESRA in Wisconsin and Madison 2 years ago. And I'm going to circulate to everyone that paper, if I can, on the chat, where we actually use the definition of list maintenance that Ohio successfully argued in all the way up to the Supreme Court and applied it to Florida and North Carolina using the definition of who had not had any activity, who didn't vote. And we find that your estimates are, as you suggest, really conservative. And I'll talk about that in a second. I think we found close to 42,000 North Carolinians and 46,000 Floridians who, over that same period of time, we looked at 2010, not voting, all the way up through 2016, who, if Ohio's definition of non-activity were applied, those people wouldn't have been able to participate. And those folks actually turned out to vote. And so the numbers were probably 3 times that in terms of the purgables, but these are people who actually voted. You found conditioning on the provisional ballots, I can't remember, 1,600 or so people who cast ballots who you were able to identify. Clearly there were a lot more that you had no information on because you couldn't match them back to the voter file who were provisionals. And that's a thing that Lee and I ran into when we were doing our paper that you referenced. So it's probably a magnitude more in terms of at least people who have been purged wrongfully, if we want to use that term. I don't have a problem with that term. But then again, I like the work that you're doing at the Brennan Center. Okay, so talked a little bit about the conditioning. I would do some robustness checks just in terms of looking at the removal codes in the voter file using, and I'm happy to share with you this canceled voter registrations from 2017, looking at that snapshot, expanding your database out. Yeah, I think this question about who is using the use it or lose it, and whether it's happening at the state level, whether it's actually happening at the county levels, that's where I think you're not finding a huge number of variations across the 100 counties in North Carolina, but that's where we're going to see it. It's not going to be at the aggregate level, at the state level, it's going to be at those county levels. And, you know, again, there's other things you could look at in terms of trying to understand the people who were purged who didn't register. You could go and look at that purge list and try to figure out more about who these people actually were. I think that's an interesting story of the folks who didn't successfully provisionally vote and have that vote count. All right, so just some things to think about and a very important topic. All right, the Xiao, Kim, and Alvarez piece. You're building on your recently published APR and that model where you're using Bayesian statistics to do this probabilistic record linkage. It's a really interesting way of detecting anomalies across, in this case, a state over time, over a 5-month period or so in 2016, which you tie in, and I think you know, you're using the Russian influence and as a hook. It's interesting. I'm not sure it really flies and whether that's the best way or whether this is really more of a methods piece. But there are some interesting things to take from it. I actually think that there should be a lot of variance across counties. You make some statements that this variance should be fairly similar. I don't think so at all. And maybe that's just because I'm in Florida and I know that the 67 supervisors elections do things very differently. They have very different capacity to do things and to do things in one way or not. We have variation, and you see it in your own with respect to some counties not having any anomalies. And that's because they're not doing much list maintenance at all during that period you happen to look at. That's actually an issue for some people. Christian Adams, William Consovoy, ACRI, PILF, Judicial Watch. These groups are all suing jurisdictions like Broward County, and I was lucky enough to work as the defense interveners counsel expert in that case, in which we defeated the efforts of Christian Adams to force Broward County to purge voters because they didn't think they were doing enough work in that area. But they're using, in fact, all the folks that are not anomalous and are focusing on them, saying that they're not doing list maintenance. So you're very close to LA County. Are you in LA County, Pasadena? You're in LA County. LA County got sued by Judicial Watch for not doing enough list maintenance. And you know what? They settled. They settled because they probably weren't doing as much list maintenance as they should have been doing. And I say that as the expert working, one of the experts working for the state of California in that lawsuit. So they're interested in the non-anomalous things that are going on. And I think that's something for you to think about in terms of which of these factors are more important or less important in terms of showing some type of list maintenance. You have a couple different definitions, I think, of which variables you're using for your matching exercise, and you might want to just make sure that those are consistent. I have some questions about those. I think you use last name, first name, date of birth, street address, daytime phone, are you using the area code? That's a separate field. If so, you should be listing that as area code, which is a separate field. I think it's field, I don't know, 37. And the actual phone. If you're using phone, you should know that maybe 1 in 6 people, 7 people have a phone. I can't remember the last time I looked. And those phone numbers probably do change a lot as people drop their landline, get a cell phone. So I'm not sure if that's the best thing you want to be doing for linking records, is a phone number. Use gender, why not race? Most people in Florida put down voluntarily race, well over 90%. And so one of the questions I have is, how about using the Florida voter registration ID number and seeing how well your model performs against actually using the registration number? Seems to me that you're setting this at about 88% match rate. You're going to have some false positives in there. Why not take a look to see how well it runs against just using monthly voter registration ID numbers? So that's one thing to think about. Henrietta Shino and Michael Martinez and Michael McDonald and I have a piece that just came out in the same special issue that a lot of us have in American politics research. I would encourage you all to look at that great edited volume. But we find, I think it's 17% when we called up registrants had some anomaly with the voter file information in Florida versus what we identified. Much of it had to do with gender and with race, but those are things to think about when building this model, it seems to me. I think those are the most things. Again, the lack of deviation is something that the folks who are using Section 8 of the NVRA are really interested in. Again, the Christian Adams and the PILFs and the ACRUs and Judicial Watches and now William Consovoy's lawsuits going on all around the country. They want to make the argument that supervisors are not cleaning up their roles. One last thing to think about too is, and I'm going to share my screen again if I can. So this gets into actually foreshadows what I'm going to speak with regarding Carl's. But most of us in this chat room, are familiar with VoteShield. And if you're not, you should be. VoteShield.us, you can email them. But this is VoteShield, and I pulled up VoteShield's monthly voter snapshots for Florida for the same period that you had. You went from June to November. And what's really interesting, as Carl was saying, looking at the time series, if you look at it, you see that there was a lot more activity going on in May and a lot more activity going on in December to January. Why is that? Well, it has to do, obviously, with the NVRA. There should be no list maintenance going on outside of deaths and felons, maybe not showing up for judicial service, jury duty, in this period. Why? Because we had a primary election with federal candidates in August, and we had a general election with federal candidates. And there's no list maintenance in terms of removal supposed to be happening in those 90-day periods. So when do counties do it? They do it here, as long as they don't have a special election going on. And why do they do it here? It's because it came right after the primary election, presidential primary election in March. So supervisors have very limited time periods in Florida to actually do any type of list maintenance in a general election year, because we've got federal candidates going. And then when you have all the special elections, you got a federal candidate on, then you can't do it at other places. So it goes back to my first point. I wouldn't expect homogeneity in list maintenance. I would expect a lot of heterogeneity, except for these little windows in which supervisors, and you didn't happen to capture those little windows in yours. I think you had an error in the book closing was October 9th in 2016, not another one, and it was extended for a week because of Hurricane Matthew. I worked with the ACLU to get that week-long registration increase, so that's kind of an anomaly there. The last thing to think about, I'll stop sharing the screen, is, again, good paper, lots to discuss on it. So that's always fun. The last thing to think about is just your paper. And I would highly recommend creating the y-axes so that they have the same scale, because they differ greatly. And when I'm reading this and it's really small print and I'm trying to figure it out, sometimes it looks like, holy crap, look at these records added. And then I realize, you know, on page 10, records added, it's actually a fraction of the records dropped for those 5 outlying counties. And that makes those 5 outlying counties even more interesting to me, right? And it's happening when it should happen, after the election. And it's probably happening because some of these are very small counties, Sumter, Taylor, Holmes, Citrus. So any change of moving dead people or people who have moved or who don't want to be registered or whatever. But the other ones are interesting, Leon and Duval County. Why are they up there? Because those are 2 of the most efficient supervisors. One happens to be a Republican, one happens to be a Democrat, but they both have really well-oiled machines. And they do their list maintenance right after the election because they probably have a federal candidate running at some special election, or they just like doing it. But that's why they're up there. And there's a lot of variation. I have talked to others where they're not doing it at all because they're exhausted. So they're going to wait, and they have a minimal staff. And so they're going to wait until some other window to do their list maintenance. So there's a lot going on there. Get the y-axes so that they're somehow comparable. And I know it does all kinds of horrible things when you're trying to get 5, charts up on the same page, but at least note it that your y-axes differ, because I didn't catch it the first read through. All right, lastly, Carl and Leah. Leah, I like the introduction. I don't think it ties in with what Carl's trying to do, but maybe you'll figure it out. I haven't figured it out yet, but it seems like this is more of a methods paper, and Carl is interested in doing his forecast modeling. I actually don't think the forecast modeling is as interesting as some of the other things in this. But Carl, you are a data hound. You've collected a massive amount of data at the county level. These aggregate totals of additions and subtractions. You've noted, I think correctly, that the EAVS data, if it is correct, it is a snapshot in time that doesn't necessarily show list maintenance because of all the variation within those bienniums. We all know that. What you can do is show that, and those can be really important. But the front end doesn't really talk about forecasting at all. It's about list maintenance. So, if you're going to keep that in there, figure out how to do it. It's good, but it just doesn't really match with the data. You're calculating into the VEP at the county level. You didn't really even spend much time. I know that you've been doing that for years because you were doing that when you were here at UF with Mike and me. And it's an amazing effort. It's also fraught with all kinds of problems. And we know that there are all kinds of problems with it because the 11th Circuit Court upheld the decision coming out of that Broward case when Brenda Snipes was being sued by Christian Adams's group, and blew it out of the water in terms of using this methodology of voter age population, much less voter eligible population, using the ACS data. There are all kinds of problems using the ACS data as a denominator when trying to figure out what is the proportion of registered voters over those who are eligible. The ACS data doesn't really account for a lot of the people who are legally eligible to be registered in a jurisdiction. And those become exploded in terms of the disparities when you go down to smaller and smaller units. All right, I actually like your anomaly detection much better, and I'm finishing this up. But we've all been cooped up. This is our chance to express ourselves. So, Carl, I'll just finish up with your paper. I lost count at around 100 in terms of the independent variables you have in your model, and it's tough to kind of explain why you want them all in there. But here's your hierarchical model, and it goes on and on. What I think is much more interesting, actually, is what you did in the previous, and you just referenced it, are these anomalies. You know, what's going on when you compare over a long period of time, 97 to 2016, we had electronic data coming in with HAVA in Florida and a centralized database, but there are some really interesting things going on in terms of where these counties had their biggest drop in registrations over time. And so I know the practitioners on this call are interested in these type of things, right? What I would go back to, and it goes back to Jian and Silvia and Mike's paper, is that most of these are actually happening in odd years, and they're happening when list maintenance should be going on. There are very few that are happening in general election years, and those are happening after an election, which again is a viable window. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I know there are a lot of questions out there. I am going to mute and go back to my kayaking.
All right, thanks, Dan. So it wouldn't be a panel at a conference if we didn't go over on the presentations and the discussant. So unfortunately, that's where we are. So we really don't have a lot of time for the presenters to respond to Dan's comments. And unfortunately, we're not going to have time for general questions, although I see that people have been posting a couple on the Q&A and the presenters have been responding to them. I have put a link in the chat to the